How would the world react to a brand new superpower? One nobody saw coming. Imagine the entire African continent, with its billion-plus people, vast resources, and strategic position, united under one flag, one government, one economy, and one military. Overnight, the balance of global power changes forever. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're looking at what might happen if Africa became one single country. Africa is made up of 54 independent nations, home to nearly 1.5 billion people, and it boasts more natural resources than almost any other landmass on Earth. Now imagine every one of those countries under a single flag, a United States of Africa. Overnight, this superstate would rewrite the global power balance, especially economically. As of 2025, Africa's combined nominal GDP is already estimated between 2.39 and 2.83 trillion US dollars. Sure, it wouldn't rival the heavyweights just yet. The US is at 29 trillion and China at 18 trillion and are still in a league of their own. But a united Africa combined GDP would instantly place it among the top 10 countries around the globe, overtaking countries like Italy and Brazil. Even European powers such as France and the UK barely edge it out at just over 3 trillion. But in terms of GDP, this newly united Africa would rank higher than the likes of Canada, South Korea, and even Russia. Africa would likely sit around the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world, with plenty of room for growth. On top of that, as a single nation, it would have control over huge energy reserves, national resources including rare metals, as well as vital ports that facilitate a lot of global trade. On paper, it sounds primed to be a new global superpower and a major player on the world stage. Before we get on to any more of the further-reaching global implications, let's explore some of the potential obstacles. Assuming a governmental administration was able to unify all of Africa, what would this change in terms of the logistics? What would it take to actually keep this newly singular country running? Well, for one, whoever's in charge would have a lot of ground to cover, literally. The entire landmass of Africa would now be considered the territory of one nation instead of 54. And well, to put it plainly, that is a lot of territory. As mentioned, Africa is the second largest continent by landmass in the world, measuring more than 11 million square miles in size, and it accounts for 20% of the Earth's land. So this new superstate doesn't just rival the size of the entire continent of Asia, but it would also be a whopping 3 times the size of all of Europe. The newly unified African continent would now have to be governed as a single country, and that is no small task. With over 1 billion people, different languages, deserts, jungles, megacities, and savannas, this wouldn't just be a new country, it would be the most diverse nation in human history. At present, Africa accounts for approximately 16% of the entire world population. Unifying that continent into one country would rank it among the most populous nations in the world, India and China. In recent years, Africa has been experiencing a population boom, and while it hasn't surpassed the populations of these two countries, with both India and China both having over 1.4 billion people, it is quickly catching up. United Nations estimates have predicted that by the end of the 21st century, Africa's population will reach 2.4 billion people, enough to account for 39% of the entire global population. So united Africa wouldn't just be huge in terms of landmass, but it would be home to a pretty sizable portion of the human race. With that many people and that much land, unifying all of Africa isn't something that could feasibly happen overnight. While we're on the topic of population, let's look at some of the potential challenges, but also possible opportunities that the government of this new US of Africa would have to face. For one, across the African continent, the median age is just over 19 years. By contrast, the global average is just over 30. What does that mean? Well, the population of this new country of Africa would skew younger, which would mean they would need to be governed by an administration willing to prioritize the needs of a more youthful population. And that doesn't mean legislating against video games or banning vapes, but instead it would require significant investment in specific public sectors, namely healthcare and education. We'll get to how a United States of Africa might fund those sectors shortly, but first let's talk about one area the new government can't afford to ignore: education. Right now, both the quality of education and access to schooling vary dramatically across the continent. Take South Sudan, for example. Their literacy rates are as low as 27%, while Libya, by contrast, is much higher at over 91%. The average literacy rate is around 64%, with pretty significant disparities between the continent's different regions. In particular, South Africa's literacy rate is at present a lot higher than parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Unsurprisingly, given how vast the continent is, education and literacy rates aren't the only major differences that the government of United Africa would need to consider. If each country country became a state in this new united nation, there would be a huge difference in health concerns from one region to the next. In sub-Saharan Africa, around 11% of the population is living with HIV/AIDS. Wiping out diseases like this would take massive healthcare investment and a powerful centralized health department, one capable of flooding the country with affordable treatment and keeping supplies moving to every corner of the continent. These might be some of the primary concerns when creating a unified African superstate. But they for sure wouldn't be the only differences between the various regions. One of the defining characteristics of the new nation would be the wide diversity of languages. There are roughly around 1,200 different languages and regional dialects spoken on the continent today, and that would be one of the biggest hurdles. How do you run a country when your citizens speak thousands of different languages? Passing laws, giving speeches, running a national news broadcast would descend into chaos without a common tongue. One way around that would be to choose a handful of official languages, probably the most widely spoken like Swahili, Arabic, French, or English, and then use them for government, education, and media purposes. Enshrining one of these wouldn't just enable effective communication between government and its citizens, but also on a state-to-state level. This would allow the different cultural groups within Africa to communicate openly with each other. It might even simplify international relations and negotiations too, which we'll circle back to in a moment. But whatever language gets official status would have to be taught in schools from Cairo to Cape Town. That means overhauling education systems in 54 different states, most of which already have their own official language. It's a logistical nightmare. And it's not just about language, it's about identity. Africa is home to wildly distinct cultures. In fact, there are almost as many people who identify as Arabic as they are who see themselves as African. The continent is also home to a variety of religious faiths. Islam and Christianity dominate, making up 90% of the population together, but scattered across the continent are vibrant traditional African faiths, and even pockets of atheists and non-practicing citizens. In order for the United States of Africa to function, there would need to be a real emphasis on fostering religious tolerance and writing laws that don't tilt toward one faith over another. If a united Africa became a reality, one of the biggest game changers would be free movement. Right now, crossing from one African country to another means visas, border checks, and a lot of red tape. But under one flag, citizens could travel state to state as easily as Americans cross from Texas to Louisiana. That's not just about taking a road trip to see neighbors, it's about unlocking massive trade potential. Of course, there is one big hurdle that could make or break that trade: currency. A united Africa could ditch dozens of currencies in favor of one national currency. It sounds simple until you try to make it real. Who decides how much the new United African dollar is worth compared to the South African rand, the Namibian dollar, or the Tunisian dollar? Some regions would see their own money worth more, others less, and that shift could spark everything from economic booms to financial panic overnight. However, doing away with the current currencies might not be necessary. A united Africa could allow for the different currencies to be more easily convertible. Let's say someone moved from Rwanda to Libya, and they needed all their francs converted into the local dinar. A unified Africa could set up an official exchange platform that guarantees equal value across states. That means that you could travel, shop, and do business anywhere on the continent without worrying about unfair conversion rates. The result would be better interstate trade, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, where would the capital of the United States of Africa be? Right now, every African nation has its own: Cairo for Egypt, Freetown for Sierra Leone, and so on. If the continent followed a US-styled model, each state could keep their capital, but there would still need to be one city at the heart of it all. The current headquarters of the African Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa are located in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, which can make it a prime contender for the role of capital of Africa. But there are regional power centers throughout the continent, like Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. What happens to them? Nigeria, for one, is home to Lagos, the largest city in Africa, and a majority of capital cities around the world tend to be the largest in their respective country, and usually located in the center. That's so the capital can be more accessible for a country's population, but also so it's better protected against invasion in the event of a war. Those criteria alone probably take Lagos out of the running, given that Nigeria is located in West Africa with the Atlantic Ocean directly below it to the south. And in any case, it's likely that major cities like Lagos, Cairo, and Johannesburg would still retain their significance as the important economic and cultural epicenters of their respective states. The latter two were likely to remain the largest financial centers in a unified Africa. So even if they didn't end up as the united country's dedicated capital, they wouldn't lose any of that importance. Cities like Los Angeles, New York, and Houston are no less important nationally or even internationally when compared to the U.S. capital of Washington, D.C. We've already talked about just how much of a presence Africa could have on the global economy, but let's circle back to how things might be a little more complex than that. For one, while that GDP is way up in the trillions, but when you divide that figure by all the people living in Africa to get the GDP per capita, it's estimated to be just shy of $2,000 per calendar year. A number of African countries like Togo and Sierra Leone actually have an even lower GDP per capita, so in order to get those numbers up, our hypothetical government would need to do some serious financial restructuring. Any economy is stimulated by more access to jobs, which can come as the result of more investing in better education and even work opportunities within the public sector. The potential issue here is that investment needs to come from somewhere. Citizens might not be on board with the use of public funds like taxes from their more economically stable state to bolster and support another. Let's use our American parallel again. If the federal government told Texans that their tax dollars were going toward building schools in somewhere like North Dakota, would they really be all on board with that? In much the same way, funding from South Africa being used to support citizens of Liberia and help combat widespread poverty in other parts of the U.S. of Africa might be met with similar pushback. It's a tricky balancing act, but there is a potential solution here. And now it's time to talk more about those natural resources and how those might be the key to boosting the economy of a united Africa. As we've mentioned, Africa is in possession of a whole lot of natural resources, from rare metals like platinum, gold, and silver, but there are other elements like zinc, cobalt, iron, copper, and limestone. And then there's valuable fuel like petroleum, coal, natural gas, diamonds, amethysts, emeralds, and other precious stones. And of course, an abundance of sugar, salt, cocoa beans, and tropical fruit. And then there's the oil. Africa is swimming in it. Nigeria, Angola, the Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, South Sudan pump out some of the most sought-after crude on the planet. And the world's thirst for it isn't slowing down. From Washington to Brussels, tankers are already hauling African oil across the oceans, with the Democratic Republic of the Congo alone feeding the US and Europe's endless appetite. Africa possesses up to 90% of the platinum in the world and 40% of the gold, along with 33% of all uranium on the Earth. That much access to valuable resources doesn't just represent access to a lot of wealth, it also buys a lot of bargaining power. Controlling so much of the world's resources, especially coveted materials and minerals, means that not only would a unified Africa be able to leverage the global demand for these goods in order to stimulate its economy, but it could also have a say in who they decide to trade with. Say a nation somewhere in the world wants to impose tariffs on imported gold. Well, look at that, Africa's decided to up the cost of the gold they're shipping there. Another country wants to threaten attack or invasion. Looks like the crude oil they so badly need for their war effort is suddenly too expensive. Controlling the supply of such valuable resources would be a huge boon to a unified Africa. And through trade, it has the potential to generate massive amounts of wealth for the country. However, having that wealth isn't going to eliminate pressing issues still facing the citizens of Africa, one of the chief amongst them being poverty. Nigeria might be the economic powerhouse of Africa, but in 2019, extreme poverty in the country affected 6 people every minute. While the rate of poverty across most of Africa is in decline, it is still widespread across the continent, largely as the result of factors like corruption, inequality, and lack of economic development. A United States of Africa couldn't just hoard its wealth. It would need a leadership capable of putting money to work where it matters the most, in schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and job creation. That means building institutions that people can actually trust, with full transparency, and launching a nationwide coordinated assault on poverty. We've talked about how international trade might benefit a united Africa, but what about internal state-to-state trade? Within the European Union, 2/3 of trade is internal, which keeps access to most of the resources and goods among member states, along with all the capital. Each European country has its own domestic market to keep itself steady in the event of any big shakeups that might disrupt global trade. Currently on the continent of Africa, the tight borders between each nation keeps their own domestic markets small, with little room for growth. Uniting Africa could present an opportunity for reforms that relax the borders between states, reducing the overall cost of internal trading. There currently isn't the infrastructure to facilitate this, but the kind of cooperation that would be required is being put into practice right now. The African Continental Free Trade Area was established back in 2018, and it's a free trade area that encompasses most of the continent. This allows member states who have signed a free trade agreement to trade with each other while agreeing to reduce their potential barriers that might make it difficult or expensive. Things like import quotas or tariffs can significantly reduce the trade of goods or services. The African Continental Free Trade Area is an effort to allow the nation-states of the continent to buy and sell from each other without the risk of one country giving another a raw deal. One of the goals of this free trade agreement is to eliminate tariffs on most goods and services over a period of either 5, 10, or 13 years, depending on a member country's level of development. Some nations still need the extra cash from the tariffs to boost their own economy, but over time, the African Continental Free Trade Area hopes to reduce these barriers to capital and labor. Its goals also include establishing a customs union for the continent and further developing the regional infrastructure to allow for easier trade. These goals could be applied on a larger scale in a unified Africa. By facilitating easier trade between its states, the United States of Africa would be stimulating its own domestic economy. This would further boost socioeconomic development, helping to reduce poverty, and it would ensure that Africa could remain a competitor in the global economy. Needless to say, a United States of Africa wouldn't rise overnight, but the potential is there. Even as 54 separate nations, Africa's growth is accelerating, with its combined GDP projected to one day overtake that of France and the UK. The existence of the African Continental Free Trade Area is a reminder that the continent and its wildly different countries and cultures are capable of wide-scale cooperation. But for that cooperation to go further and develop into a fully formed country, Africa would need to strike a delicate balance and not push for economic development at the expense of its citizens' well-being. Is a United States of Africa impossible? Not at all. Will it happen tomorrow? Definitely not. But with smart strategy, strong leadership, and steady, sustainable growth, this hypothetical supernation could one day be real. And it wouldn't just exist, it would dominate. A united Africa could rewrite the global power map, shaping trade, diplomacy, and culture on a scale the world had never seen. If Africa united into a single country, it could become one of the most powerful forces on the planet. But what happens to the other countries left on their own? Watch The Loneliest Country in the World to find out, or click on this video instead.